Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. It's my pleasure to welcome our participants, our audience from all over the world to this very special webinar, and for me to welcome also our panelists, our moderator, Professor Wafa Sadr from Columbia University, Rana Hajje, Seth Berkeley, Susan Bueno, and Musad Al-Razouqi. I will introduce each of them more fully in due course. Since the start of the pandemic, we've hosted at the Columbia Global Centers multiple webinars focused on various aspects of COVID-19. So far, the picture has, of course, been pretty grim. I am here in Jordan, where today the country reached a new record of 3,800 incidents in one day. This is, though, as grim as the picture is, this is the first event that potentially brings in a silver lining to this crisis. The crisis, one should say also, has really been two interrelated crises. We have the public health crisis posed by the virus itself, which has now killed more than 1.1 million people globally. And we have also the economic crisis posed by government-imposed lockdowns, social distancing, which has devastated the economies, destroyed livelihoods, and disrupted our communities, in some cases permanently. Many have framed this as an either-or between economic health and public health. But this is actually a false choice. The two are deeply intertwined, as we discussed in a global seminar in July, which Dr. Sadr also participated in. Needless to say, our lives have been radically altered by the crises, both the epidemiologic and the economic. And it's still unclear when we will be able to go back to any kind of normal. It's interesting to see how different countries have taken different approaches to dealing with the crisis, leading to different outcomes economically, but also different outcomes in terms of the spread of the virus. As we know, for example, early on, Sweden and the United Kingdom both took a laissez-faire approach to shutdowns and restrictions. Disastrous consequences in the UK, tens of thousands dead, and the National Health Services was nearly overwhelmed. Less severe in Sweden has been the case, but still one of the world's highest per capita death rates. You look at Pakistan and Egypt, on the other hand, where due to the sheer population size and difficulty in implementing restrictions, both countries experienced massive outbreaks over the summer. More recently, however, case numbers seem to have started to taper off. US and Brazil, with political leadership that leaves a lot to be desired, downplayed the seriousness of the virus to tragic effect. Global leaders in total case numbers and among the top in deaths per capita from those two countries. Only a few countries, through quick border closure, comprehensive lockdowns, and effective test and trace systems, have been able to keep the virus at bay. We hear about New Zealand, China, Thailand, South Korea as examples of those. But regardless of how each country has handled the crisis, we all agree that we need to have effective treatment and ultimately a vaccine. The urgency to develop a COVID-19 vaccine that is both safe and effective has led to what is perhaps the greatest technological undertaking in the history of humankind. With tens of billions of dollars in global funding, more than 200 vaccine candidates, and hundreds of thousands of volunteer test subjects, we are attempting to compress a process that often takes more than a decade into a small fraction of that period. The challenges posed by this project are monumental. Although we are now closing in on several promising candidates, many obstacles remain before we reach the point of widespread global immunization. The race for producing a vaccine is underway. Pfizer may begin rolling out its vaccine for emergency use in the US by late November. Moderna has a similar timeline for emergency use. Several of the Chinese vaccines are now being widely used in China. The Sinopharm vaccine has received emergency approval in the United Arab Emirates as well.
Thank you very much, Safwan, for inviting all of us to participate in this very important webinar that's focusing really on two aspects that are very critical moving forward for controlling the pandemic. One is vaccines, and the other one are treatments for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce briefly our panelists today. We are very fortunate to have a very well-respected and highly renowned group of individuals. So I'll start by introducing Dr. Rana Hajj. Dr. Hajj is a senior public health leader, and she has extensive experience in global health and public health and health management, with a particular focus on the Middle East region. She's currently the director of the program management at the WHO Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office, EMRO. Welcome, Dr. Hajj. I want to also introduce Dr. Susan Bueno. Welcome. And Dr. Bueno is associate professor in the Department of Molecular Genetics and Microbiology in the Faculty of Biological Sciences of the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. And she has largely focused on issues regarding vaccines and vaccine development. Welcome, Dr. Bueno. I also would like to introduce briefly to you all Dr. Musad Al-Razouki, and he's the Chief Business Development Officer at Kuwait Life Sciences Company. And this is an integrated healthcare company that advances healthcare services and systems in the Middle East region, working with a large number of stakeholders and dealing with their medical technology requirements. Welcome, Dr. Al-Razouki. I then want to present, last but not least, good friend and colleague, Dr. Seth Berkley. And Dr. Berkley has been the leader of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, as its CEO since August of 2011. And he's really been spearheading a very important mission of how can we provide access to important vaccines to children around the world, particularly in the poorest countries around the world, and has been also playing a key role as Gavi is also one of the co-sponsors of a COVAX initiative, and we'll get into that very soon during our discussion. So welcome everybody to our webinar today. And I'd like to start by asking each of you a brief question before we get into the conversation. And maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Hajj, and maybe you can talk to us about something in brief about the ACT initiative, and what does that mean, and what does it stand for, and what are its goals and objectives?
Yes, hi, good evening, and good morning for the US participants, and thank you again very much for having me. The ACT Accelerator or Access to COVID Tools is a global collaboration that WHO and partners established initially in June, and then recently they just updated the strategy. And it has really, it's kind of like almost unprecedented collaboration to be able to advance and accelerate the development of tools that will help us better fight the pandemic. And they have 4 pillars, actually. There is the first one focuses on vaccines, and this is mainly through the COVAX facility. Then we have also an arm focusing on diagnostics, on rapid specialty development of new and rapid diagnostics. There's another arm focusing on therapeutics that has been also in the process of accelerating the trials and the development of many of the new treatments. And there's a 4th arm that was added relatively recently, focusing on strengthening the health systems that are needed for all of these tools to be implemented at country level.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hadje. And maybe now we can focus a bit on what about in terms of everybody's eagerly awaiting, of course, a safe and effective vaccine as an important global priority. So Dr. Bueno, can you shed light on, in broad strokes, and what are the goals in development of a vaccine? What are the immune responses that we're hoping to see, and what are some of the safety considerations as well?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent panel of speakers to share with you and explain a little bit more about and discuss a little bit more about the challenges for vaccines development and treatments. And definitely there are several challenges with this new coronavirus. First of all, there is no history of another vaccines for COVID, for other coronaviruses that can shed light with what would be the best strategy or the best immune response that correlate with protection. That is something that fosters the requirement that the science should be done in all the aspects of the development of effective and safe vaccines. Starting from the preclinical assays, that in this case, it has been very unprecedented in the history of science, that if the collaboration with the international partners can lead to the identification of the causal agent of this disease, and then rapidly implement several multiple platforms for the development of potential vaccine candidates. And then the challenge to implement new animal models in the preclinical stage that can allow us to test these kind of vaccines and then evaluate which will be the most important or the most promising for generating a good immune response that can prevent the disease caused by this virus. And then if we think that this virus was described 10 months ago, we now have 10 candidate vaccines that are in clinical trial phase 3, which is evaluating the efficacy of this strategy of immunization to prevent this disease. For the most important things for the development of vaccines is to go through all the process for the testing for both the capacity of these different platforms to generate, be safe, generate an immune response, and that this immune response will be effective to prevent the disease caused by this virus. So one of the most important things is to cover all these stages in the proper and timely manner and evaluate by evidence, the scientific evidence, the capacity of these several strategies to prevent the disease. And one of the main goals is to have a safe and not only one vaccine, but different vaccines that can be available worldwide, that can cover different aspects of the requirement for different countries.
Great, thank you. And I'm wondering, Dr. Berkeley, and maybe some of our audience may not be familiar with Gavi, if you can tell us a bit about the mission for Gavi, but also in particular, the goals and objectives of the COVAX collaboration.
Thanks so much, Watha. And, Gavi was established 20 years ago at a time when immunization, was kind of stagnant, and all these new powerful vaccines were coming out of science and came out in a way that were expensive, made available in wealthy countries, not made available in low-income countries. And Gavi was born as a partnership to try to change that. And the reason it's called an alliance is because we don't duplicate anybody else. We bring together WHO and UNICEF and the World Bank and the Gates Foundation, many other organizations, but countries, the different pharmaceutical companies. And frankly, it's been an incredibly successful partnership. We've immunized over the last 20 years, 822 million additional children, plus another billion in campaigns. preventing more than 14 million deaths. We've increased the numbers of vaccines from 5 vaccines when we started now to vaccines against 17 diseases. And we vaccinate more than 50% of the world's children. And what's important in doing that is we're able to get out doses that cover about 500 million doses a year and are able to deliver those because, of course, vaccines don't deliver themselves. One or two other factors is that the way we structure it is so that it's not a handout, but a hand up. Countries all pay something. If you're very poor, you pay a little. As you get wealthier, you pay more until eventually you transition out of Gavi support. So that's a little bit about what the model is. When we were actively involved in the last vaccine was the Ebola vaccine, where we worked to create an advanced purchase agreement for that. And work to make sure that there were doses available before there was a licensed product, which was used in DRC in the last few outbreaks. But when we first figured out that this was that COVID was a virus, that it was spreading, of course, our immediate concern was, could we make these vaccines available to the traditional countries we think of, which is the lower income countries? And what we quickly realized is even more than 2009, when it really happened, was that there wouldn't be any vaccines to distribute if wealthy countries bought up all the vaccines, given the demand that's there. And so we created this new COVAX facility working with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, with WHO, with other partners. And we had no idea whether there would be interest globally in this. And it was very interesting because the 92 poorest countries, and that's low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and then small economies that are IDA eligible, those are the ones that are going to be supported by official development assistance. But in terms of upper middle income countries and high income countries, we had no idea. And at a time of nationalism and at a time of people turning away from multilateralism, it's been fabulous to see the interest. And so we have now 184 countries engaged with COVAX now. We expect that to rise to 190 to 100, or 195 countries. And we're in the process now of procuring 2 billion doses for those countries to be used by the end of 2021. The last thing I'd say, of course, is that the distribution of these products, this will be the largest scale up of vaccines in history. We've done a lot of other scale ups. We've introduced now 496 new vaccines in the poorest countries of the world. So we have experience, but this is going to be different. And so we're in the process of working now to create bespoke plans in every country to begin ask the question, who will they vaccinate? How strong is their cold chain? What is their supply chain? What type of assistance do they need? And we'll be working on building that up. So I'm sure we'll discuss this more during the seminar, but thank you.
Thank you very much. And, thank you for highlighting I call it's another cascade, the cascade from having in hand a vial that has a safe and effective vaccine. How do we get that into the arm of the person who needs it, wherever they are in the world? And there's so many steps along the way, and each and every one of them is critical in order to succeed. So Dr. Razuki, maybe to get us started, early in the COVID-19 pandemic, there was unfortunately sort of a bidding war that occurred in terms of procurement or securing particularly personal protective equipment, meaning masks and other supplies and testing kits. So how do you see us avoiding doing this when it comes to potentially a vaccine or treatment once available?
Thank you very much, Dr. Wafa. And again, thank you to Columbia for organizing this amazing panel, for inviting me. It's truly an honor as a Columbia alumnus to be part of this distinguished panel. Definitely, I believe that, let's say, from a global perspective, the geopolitical risk, I believe, has been significantly mitigated, especially given the efforts of organizations which are on this panel, such as the WHO and Gavi. Having said that, I believe that also many countries, especially the wealthy countries, like the country I am from, Kuwait, and the other GCC countries, also have a very strong humanitarian track record. My own country, Kuwait, has donated tens of billions of dollars over the past decade to various humanitarian initiatives. We've hosted various conferences, whether it's for refugee relief in Syria, whether it's for the rebuilding of Iraq. We have hosted multiple, let's say, donor conferences here in Kuwait and have participated on both the multilateral level with various organizations as a donor, I would say, above our weight. And then also from an investment perspective, the different sovereign wealth funds of the GCC, whether it's the ADIA in Abu Dhabi and the Qatar Investment Authority in Doha, or even us here in Kuwait, we've actually invested early on in many of these leading candidate companies. So despite the US's effort, the $10 billion Warp Speed initiative, many of these companies had actually received funding from the GCC. Moderna received funding as early as 2010 from the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. CureVac received investment from the Qatar Investment Authority in June, just after the German government made an investment. Us in Kuwait were actually early investors through KLSC in a company called Themis in Vienna, in Austria. So I would like to think that as a human society, we'll probably do a better job than some of, let's say, the states in the United States, where there was a lot of actually, I wouldn't use the word hoarding, but at least there wasn't as much cooperation between the various states that make up the United States when it came to both ventilators or PPE. I believe that thankfully, let's say, given our small size here in the region as the GCC, we tend to look at the Pan-Arab initiatives and the Pan-Middle East initiatives a bit more favorably. And we certainly, whether it's directly through our investment vehicles or through the many organizations, the charitable organizations such as the Kuwait Fund or the Arab Fund, which is also based in Kuwait, we do have a proclivity to try and at least disperse the wealth as much as possible. And so definitely, I do hope that the geopolitical risk will be mitigated. I think the bigger risk right now is helping our politicians understand the process that Professor Bueno mentioned. In the past, as a human society, the quickest we've developed a vaccine was back in the 1960s, when it took 4 years to develop the mumps vaccine. So today, to have 10 candidates in stage 3 after 10 months is an amazing feat. Yeah. And let's hope that we'll continue to work together as a human society once both the treatments and the vaccines are available to properly distribute them.
Thank you very much. And I encourage the audience to please feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to your questions in due course. Maybe I'll start by the kind of the way the distal end of that cascade of vaccines, and which is obviously that we need to have populations and people willing and eager to get the vaccine. And there have been some concerns based on several surveys that have been done in the US and some other countries around the world that seem to indicate that there's a bit of hesitancy, that we're not getting the high, at least indications of high interest in the vaccine. So we're getting more like 50 to 60% of people indicating that they would go and get vaccinated. So starting from that distal end, I'm wondering, Dr. Hadji, what your thoughts are in terms of how do we, it doesn't help to have a vaccine that's safe and effective if people don't get it, who need it. How do we get high uptake, high coverage with a vaccine? And how do we achieve this? And what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, thank you, Wafa. I mean, this is really a very important issue. I mean, at the end, with all these efforts to develop and accelerate development, if we don't have people willing to take it, we're not going to go very far. I mean, of course, WHO and all the partners, with Gavi in particular, especially in the low-income countries, we have been working for years now on dealing with vaccine hesitancy and better understanding really what are the barriers that prevent people from accepting vaccines. And and often these it's hard to generalize because many of the barriers behind vaccine hesitancy are usually very context specific. So the key is to really be able to collect all the evidence needed to understand, depending on the country's context. Sometimes it's within the country, certain communities or sub-communities where these issues are a concern, so that at least our approaches will be driven to by the evidence. So based on this understanding, we actually encourage or support the design of a mix of strategies that are tailored to really respond to these issues. I mean, first, I think it's very important to promote the investments in quality immunization systems and primary care. In many countries, there are concerns about the quality of the vaccines, the quality sometimes of the cold chain, how vaccines are preserved, etc. That might, or even the quality of the places, the primary care units where people go to get these vaccines. But also, I think very important for us to provide very credible information on the safety, the benefits of the vaccines, the severity of the diseases that people may prevent by taking these vaccines. What we were seeing in the US, even, for example, before, especially the US and Europe, where, and also parts of Central Asia, where we have seen vaccine hesitancy, is that many of the new generations have even forgotten about some of these diseases that are now, preventable by vaccination. Many physicians, actually, or pediatricians in some countries have never seen a case of measles, until recently. So I think, bringing or raising awareness about the severity of some of these diseases that we are preventing by vaccination, I think it's very critical. But very importantly, we are trying to work with local communities, with influencers in these communities, engaging them so that we build the trust in the vaccines and we address their concern. And throughout the pandemic, we've been dealing with what we're calling the pandemic of misinformation and infodemics. And I think there are so many rumors that have circulated about the virus initially, now already about the vaccines. I think as a vaccine becomes also closer to becoming available, I am sure, with the more specific information we have about, sometimes the uncertainties also lead to a lot of concerns and anxiety. But as we have a well-known vaccine that is out of the phase 3 trials, where we have not just the effectiveness, but the safety data available, we will be able to tailor the messages and develop, better communication strategies to ensure that the vaccine will be also more acceptable. So, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. And I think you brought up some very important points, which is we need to be doing this work now to prepare, and I think not to wait, but rather to start early on, to be prepared for the kinds of myths and misconceptions. And the other important point you raise is working with the communities. And we know that COVID-19, similar to many other health threats, shines a light on disparities in societies, and often the most vulnerable are the most severely affected. So that's where working with these disenfranchised communities and their leaders and so on would be really important at this point in time as we move ahead. And Dr. Berkeley, I'm just curious again, for many of the work of Gavi, and the focus has been largely on childhood vaccinations. You've used certain strategies and so on, as you mentioned, either vaccination through childhood vaccination clinics or campaigns. How do you see moving forward with making the vaccine available? What are you thinking in terms of how we're going to deploy this in the many countries around the world?
So thanks for the question, and I'll come back to it in a second, but I want to build on what Rana said, because I agree with everything she said. I would have answered almost exactly the same way. But just to add one point is one of the reasons you're seeing such a set of coalitions come together right now is there's an anti-science coalition, there's an anti-government coalition, there's all kinds of conspiracy theories, and for some reason they've all come together and reinforced each other. And part of it is the speed of where we are. So what I agree with Rana, in the wealthy countries, I think as you see vaccines that have gone through a rigorous safety process and people start getting them and people see that people are able to resume some sense of normality in their lives, that will change many of the opinions. In the developing world, of course, they get infected by the misinformation that's passing in the West. And I just came off I was at the World Health Summit earlier today in Germany, and I was peppered by anti-vaccine questions from, that audience, which of course always surprises me. But these are real issues that are going on. I want to say one other thing, and then I'll answer the question, which is what's really important is we think about the strategy of rolling these vaccines out. So Northeastern University recently did a study that showed if you took the 2 billion doses we think that will be available in the next year, and you distributed that to the 50 wealthiest countries, you would reduce the deaths by 33%. This was a modeling exercise. If you took those same 2 billion doses and distributed them based on populations to all countries, you would reduce 61% of the deaths. And the reason is, in a pandemic, we're only safe if everybody is safe. And so we need to think about that strategy, which is very important, and have that messaging going out, because right now people tend to think, oh, if I get vaccinated or my family gets vaccinated, I'm all taken care of, but not with this pandemic, which is moving so quickly. To go back to your question, you're right. A lot of the work we do is in children, but of course we roll out cervical cancer vaccines in adolescents. We roll out epidemic vaccines in large swaths of the population, like yellow fever or meningitis. So we have some experience with that. We don't have a lot of experience in the developing world with vaccines for the elderly. So we need a little bit of an all hands on deck strategy where we begin to work with other health initiatives that are working on things like hypertension or diabetes or TB or HIV or diseases that cut across different groups, and see if we can build on those as opposed to creating things from scratch. The other thing I'd say is that the time to prepare, as you implied, is right now. And it's also simple things. We say to the country leaders, if you don't have a list of all your health workers now's the time to get that. You should have it, but if you don't have it, now's the time to get it, so that once we enunciate, we can then, vaccinate. And one of the things we're going to need to do is create new tools to be able to track the vaccines, track the people, particularly for vaccines that are going to require more than one dose and follow-up, or if there are different vaccines that are being used in the same country, knowing which vaccine which person received. So there is a whole technological arm to what we're trying to do to help us with this. And you're absolutely right, this helps us in the future. Of course, we don't use flu vaccines in many developing countries, but we should be using them certainly for healthcare workers, maybe more broadly. But also, in the West, we use pneumococcal vaccines, for example, in the elderly. We should be thinking about that. So this may help us on our pathway towards having a view of the life course for vaccination and not just thinking of it as children. Over.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm also always amazed, even in developed countries, how poorly we do in terms of some of the adult vaccines, very much underutilized, even at this point in time. I mean, I think we're all pushing as much as possible for influenza vaccination, particularly this year, but still utilization is not optimal, or other adult vaccines. One of the questions from our audience, Dr. Bueno, is, when you think of all the studies that are now going on and in phase 3, can you give I know it's a tough question, but do you have an estimate? People are asking, when do we think we'll have potentially in our hand a safe and effective vaccine that's gone through phase 3 studies?
Right. Thank you for the question. And yes, it's very difficult to think about a time when we are going to have an safe and effective vaccine, and ideally more than one effective vaccine. But I think one of the most important things is to transmit to the audience and all the population that all the vaccine development needs to go through a very strict system of evaluation of the most important and safety and in the efficacy. And this needs to be done with a high amount of population that will be included in these studies, and then the evaluation of the safety and also the capacity of the immunization to generate an efficient immune response to prevent the most serious effect of the disease needs to be done in a timely manner. So although during the phase 3 trial that usually needs to be done and should last for at least 1 year in order to both evaluate the safety of these prototypes and also the capacity of these vaccines to reduce the incidence of the disease in the vaccinated population. It is possible to evaluate previously the results of these studies and determine whether the prototypes have reached some efficacy. That can be a good, like a good sign that this vaccine could be actually be approved, for instance, for emergency use. But definitely the vaccines studies need to be done in a long time, because once the vaccines in the current clinical trials can be determined and effective, there is several other things that need to be taken into consideration. For instance, if this kind of immune response induced by the vaccines will be long-lasting, or we will need to think about on a different scheme of vaccinations, for instance, 2 or yearly, or changes in the strategy that these vaccines will be administered to the population that needs to be taken into consideration. So probably in the vaccines that are most advanced in phase 3 clinical trials, we will have some efficacy information by the next year, probably, hopefully by the end of this year. But this doesn't mean that we have the cure and then all the other strategies that had been evaluated or will be evaluated in clinical trials should stop. No, in this case, we will have some information, but further analysis needs to be done. Long-lasting immunity needs to be determined, and also the potential long-time side effects needs to be also evaluated. So I think that probably if we are very optimistic by the next year, probably we will have the first potential candidates that can start to be used in the population, but also taking into consideration the information that our other panelists has been given to us, that this needs to be also implemented in a specific distribution plan that maybe can take a while to get all the most susceptible population to be targeted by the vaccines, and then thinking about the rest of the population in order to induce a herd immunity that can reduce at minimum the incidence of the disease.
Thank you very much. And Professor Safwan, please feel free to also engage in the conversation as well.
It's been just fascinating hearing the various perspectives, and we're getting some wonderful questions through the Q&A button, which I hope we will get to in time, of course. But my question is Dr. Razouqi, who, you know, Mus'ab, do you have a sort of a unique combination among the panelists in that you are both a doctor, a surgeon, a medical doctor, and also somebody with an MBA with experience in venture capital and private equity, and you sit sort of on both sides of it, including in your current work with the life sciences company in Kuwait, and as a board member of the Arab Company for Drug Industry and Medical Appliances. So perhaps you can share with us sort of, you know, your perspective from that vantage point, you know, sitting on the cusp of both the medical as well as sort of the financial and the business and the economic side of things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Safwan. I believe really we have been humbled as an international community by many of the large pharma companies who have really admitted that this vaccine, once it will be made available, will be available at cost. And the same can be said of many diagnostic companies on a global level as well. Some of the biggest diagnostic companies are also offering, whether it's a rapid test or any other form of test, also on an on-cost basis. So that I think has been extremely humbling from the investment community. I also believe that the rapid rise of a lot of small cap pharmaceutical companies in the United States in particular has also really reflected how the investment community is very hungry to be, let's say, participating in the search for a vaccine. Some of the top candidates have increased in terms of stock price 300, 400, even 500%. Others have gone up and down from 1,000% rise back down to a few percentage points. So it has been a roller coaster ride, I would say, from an investment perspective. From our perspective at Quote Life Sciences, and I think I can echo because I've had multiple conversations with other sovereign wealth fund managers who are focused on the life sciences and healthcare space, that we try to take a measured approach. Certainly, we cannot put all our eggs in one basket when it comes to funding the development of the vaccine from a corporate perspective. I would also like to echo that I believe the same strategy should be adopted by many governments around the world. As governments, we are not known for being as efficient as possible. We need to be as effective as possible. What that means is really, as Mr. Seth mentioned, we need to think of this as a global challenge, and we need to actually try and not go for the easiest political win or the lowest hanging political fruit, but instead really try and work with our constituents and work with our populations to understand that, first of all, this is a global pandemic, and we are only as strong as our weakest link. And definitely that's why, whether it's an investment perspective or political win perspective, that should take a backseat to public health. And as you also very eloquently mentioned, Professor Safwan, it is not a zero-sum game. You need actually to have the public health recovery before you have the economic recovery. It's not one or the other. They go hand in hand, and certainly this is something that we are at least trying to practice on a day-to-day basis at Quote Life Sciences.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe a follow-up to Dr. Hajj from a regional perspective. I mean, how do you see these things playing out in terms of the public-private partnerships around trying to contain the pandemic at this stage, and then in the future, when it comes to making vaccines available and widely used? How do you deal with? I'm fascinated by what Seth shared. I think it was a Northeastern study, right? About take that at the global level. What happens when you distribute to the 50 wealthiest nations? 33% drop in death versus 61% drop in death if you do it in a more egalitarian basis. Can we take that to a more micro level, at the regional level, and perhaps then even at the national level? So I know there are two questions, but they are somewhat interrelated, if you don't mind.
They muted me. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Safwan. I mean, I think, at the regional level, we have been part of that whole global, coalition that Seth mentioned earlier with regards to COVAX. I mean, COVAX or ACT in particular had the goal wasn't, or the main objective wasn't just the accelerated development, but this fair and equitable distribution of all the COVID tools, whether it's vaccines or others. But we have been, just to comment on a couple of issues there, because it's relevant to your questions. We have been working very, very closely with countries, throughout this pandemic, especially with the ministries of health. And we have encouraged not just for vaccine access or improving access to vaccines and therapeutics, but also for the overall management of this pandemic. We have encouraged this whole of what we call whole of government, whole of society approach. And I don't want these two expressions to be just buzzwords. I mean, really, I think this pandemic has highlighted the need to have multiple sectors engaged. Ministries of health alone cannot do this, especially when it comes to dealing with all the social restrictions, the economic impact on the communities, the need to engage the civil, the societies, the need to engage engage all the civil communities, etc. So I think from the beginning, overall, we have been encouraging this approach. And most of our countries, as part of developing an overall, what we call the strategic response plan and preparedness plan, they were encouraged to put together coordination, what we call coordination committees or some kind of coordination mechanisms in place at the very high level. You know, usually they are run out of prime minister's level, but they engage all the relevant sectors, health, finance, ministries of interior, many of the private sector, the internal, the civil society, etc. So I think it's good to have this in mind. And also the other issue that I would like to comment on, as Seth also mentioned, I mean, this pandemic has uncovered so many gaps in our overall preparedness and response in terms of the systems in place, whether it is the wealthiest countries to the countries, the countries with very low income and the middle income countries. So we are being a bit opportunistic and taking advantage of the pandemic to strengthen many of the systems that are needed. So for example, when we talk about vaccine delivery, we mentioned the importance of having an adult or a delivery for adult vaccination, because this has not been taken, it was not given probably the priority it needs before. The focus was always on childhood immunization. I mean, we're trying to work with the health sector, we're trying to work with the private sector to have, especially the health sector, because of the healthcare workers and the first responders, to have, an adult immunization platforms. The other thing maybe I would like to mention at the regional level, what we are encouraging also is working with all the academic institution sectors, because typically, in countries, I mean, there are many things that are run out of the public sector, but there hasn't been in our region, and I see it in many other regions, there's not always this active engagement of academic institutions, but for this pandemic in particular, they are heavily engaged, especially when it comes to research, participation in clinical trials. And this has been one of these other silver lining or, other side benefits that we have seen in our region in terms of strengthening capacity for research. I mean, this is like, for the first time ever in our region, for example, we have 7 countries who are doing phase 3 clinical trials for vaccines. We have never had that. I mean, the research capacity for vaccine in particular had been one of our weaker research platforms in the region. So again, I mean, this is responding more to your question about that. But maybe one, sorry.
No, please.
Well, I was going to mention, the 4 arms that I mentioned at the beginning of ACT. The one about strengthening health systems is actually a collaboration between World Bank, Global Fund, and WHO. So many of these, Seth mentioned that for the facility for COVAX, for the ACT vaccine arm, it's a collaboration between Gavi, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and WHO. The diagnostics pillar, we actually have the collaboration between, again, WHO, Global Fund, and FIND, which is also an organization that focuses on innovative development of diagnostics tools. So this kind of a global, really, partnership of these major organizations has been one of the main pluses or innovations of the ACT initiative as well.
That's great. That's great to hear, Rana. And I'm surmising from what you're saying is that you're seeing also cross-border cooperation and collaboration within the region. Something that is very, very necessary. So not only at the global level, but also at the regional level, we're seeing that take place.
Well, yeah, as I think Seth mentioned, this pandemic, I mean, if the whole world is not, no one is safe until everyone is safe, and I think, we're, in a way, we're mandated, or member states, countries are mandated based on the international health regulations that they have all signed up for in 2005. They are mandated to have collaborations across borders. Of course, we've had our challenges with IHR implementation since it was, signed in 2005. But this pandemic has really shown the importance of cross-collaboration, especially in terms of, the measures that need to be done at ports of entry, ensuring countries share information. It remains one of the big challenges, but things are moving definitely more in the right direction with this pandemic.
Thank you. So Wafa, Dr. Sadr, I have a question for you. And that is, as an epidemiologist and as a university professor at Columbia, you started the International Center for AIDS Prevention. And I've had the distinct honor of traveling with you somewhat extensively in Africa and seeing how ICAP and the work that you do has really saved tens of millions of lives. And I think, as we look at COVID, we have been looking at past pandemics and how we've dealt with them. And HIV/AIDS is perhaps the deadliest pandemic in the modern era. What can we learn from how the world and both the scientific community as well as the broader community, how we've dealt with HIV/AIDS over the past 20, 30 years? What can we learn from that experience that you think is applicable, what has been applied, where we're missing perhaps the boat again, and particularly in terms of reaching the world's poorest communities? So, more broadly, what can we learn from the HIV/AIDS fight?
Thank you very much, Safwan. I think there are many lessons learned from HIV that are applicable to COVID-19 and should really guide us moving forward. I would say, I would start, number one, I would say the focus on the need to strengthen health systems. I think as Dr. Hadja mentioned, is that you could not do HIV programming or tuberculosis programming or any programming effectively with high quality without investment in health system. And what I mean by this is what we've had to do for the HIV global response is invest in the workforce in terms of recruitment and training and mentorship of workforce and also being creative in terms of the workforce in general. Much more of task shifting, task sharing to be able to reach the largest numbers of individuals. Investment in laboratory infrastructure is another one that comes to mind. Investment in data systems and surveillance is very critical for the COVID response and would be critical as we move forward and try to collect data on people who've received the vaccine, for example, and how they've done, if they've had any side effects or not. So I think that investment in health system is very critical. I would say another critical lesson learned is engaging communities. And this gets back to how do you gain the confidence of people, and particularly when you're dealing with a stigmatizing condition like HIV. And we have all the evidence now that COVID-19 is being stigmatized and people with COVID-19 are being stigmatized. So we need to engage communities that are most severely affected, who are often mistrustful of government, mistrustful of our own health services. So we need to effectively engage communities, which I think is another critical lesson learned that enabled achieving the goals in HIV. I would say a third lesson has been very importantly leadership. And having effective leadership at all levels, particularly at national levels, subnational levels, and having enlightened, informed leadership and a national response and commitment at a high level is very important. And I think last but not least, I think also really being aware that there'll always be myths and misconceptions. And we've seen that with HIV again and again. And to be out there to acknowledge the misconceptions and address them rather than ignore them, which is another. So those are some thoughts. But Seth, you wanted to add something? Seth, you raised your hand.
Seth raised his hand.
Yeah, so Safwan, you asked the question, what has to be done thinking about this in the future? And I think we have to make it absolutely clear. It is evolutionarily certain that we will have more outbreaks going forward. We have, temperature change, we have increasing population, we have movement of people, we are burning down, forest for grasslands to feed people, et cetera, et cetera. And with that, we're going to have more exposure, we're going to have more outbreaks. And so the question that really relates to this is, how much will we do in peacetime to prevent these outbreaks from happening? And that's really important. I can tell you when the Ebola outbreak occurred, everybody said to me, there's no question about money, resources aren't the issue, we'll do whatever it takes. And then when I went to raise money for vaccines right afterwards, they were like, Ebola, that's yesterday's problem. And so we tend to work really hard during epidemics, pandemics, and then we ignore it. There's a lot of work. Wafa's just laid out a whole range of issues in terms of health systems and surveillance. But, on the vaccine side, you can build early warning systems, but you also can create platform technologies. You can learn how to manufacture them and have them ready to go in case a new disease occurs. You can drop them in. You can have the manufacturing facilities. You can have financing. We can work on distribution systems. We can solve the labeling problems, regulatory harmonization, indemnification, liability. All of those things can be solved so that we are ready. And what it requires, though, is at a time when you don't see this as a problem, that you continue to invest and make it a priority. And, Bill Gates in his TED Talk, talked about the evolutionary certainty of this in 2015. I gave the back-to-back TED Talk, the one that nobody watched, but that was about how we prepare these things. And the point being that, he said, for warfare, we practice all the time. We have war games. We constantly are doing, models and thinking through it. We don't do that for epidemics. And yet, as I said, it's evolutionarily certain that we're going to see more of them. So I think that, to me, is a clarion call for the world to change the way it thinks about this. Over.
And maybe just to build on, building on what you just said, I think a lot of our conversation is focused on vaccines, and I want to just shift a bit because the topic of our webinar is also treatment. And clearly, COVID-19 is a serious illness with substantial mortality and morbidity. And we're learning, for example, that even people who recover from COVID-19 may have long-term symptoms and disability. And of course, there's also a substantial mortality and death from COVID-19. So maybe I can turn to, what about treatments? Should we be, how are we investing in identifying new treatments, and how do we get them on the acceleration, the accelerator as well? So maybe Dr. Bueno, and maybe I can shed light on the treatment side as well.
Yes, but first of all, I would like to mention one important thing. Definitely, for infectious diseases, the use of vaccines is the most cost-effective measure that exists for the prevention. Prevention will be actually much more less cost, and due to this, the nature of these vaccines and how they work, probably they are victim of their own success, and this is the reason why there is so much hesitancy, probably because when these vaccines or this disease can be prevented by vaccines, the problem is that we start to forget about what the real disease looks like, as was mentioned before, that probably we are more concerned about the side effects of vaccines than the effects caused by the disease itself. So in this case, I believe that it's very important to raise awareness in the population. And I believe that it's very important that the scientific community works very close to the governments and also for education in the population. And I think that this is key. In the case of treatments, definitely a treatment will be more tangible for the population, because it's intent for to use for the population that is suffering the disease, that is suffering the effects of this virus or any other disease. And in this case, definitely is not the most cost-effective strategy to be used in kind of pandemic like that, but needs to be addressed as well. And I think in this case, there are also several programs for the acceleration of the both the design of new treatments, new drugs, and also the use of drugs used for other uses that can be effective in reducing the most severe effect of this disease in the population. And I think this is a very important point that needs to be taken in account, but taking also in consideration that this will be intended for the population that is most affected, that is already having the disease, and probably, as you mentioned, we could say life with the increased investment in the generation of new drugs and new treatments, but long-lasting effect could be also a problem that could not be addressed by treatments. And in this case, I still believe that the investment in all the development of both vaccines and also treatment needs to be equal.
Thank you. And yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think some people have raised the concern that there's been much more attention to making vaccines available through Gavi and so on, and maybe less attention to the side of effective treatment. So I think, and several people put questions in the chat box about intellectual property and how people see that potentially influencing access to treatments in particular.
Let's remember that the market for treatments is extremely high. What will people pay when they're critically ill? And in a sense, as you know, always the economics for treatments have been better than for vaccines, although in this case, vaccines may be also doing well.
Yeah. I think it's actually an unusual situation in that way. And I wonder, Musad, whether you've thought about this. You mentioned small companies in the U.S. engaging in COVID and so on, and potentially new treatments. Several are working on monoclonal antibodies now, as well as antivirals and so on. So maybe you want to comment on how you see the treatment market or the treatment potential in contrast to the vaccine.
Absolutely. So that's something that I have been personally following, I would say, since T-0 when the virus really started affecting us here in Kuwait in late February. And certainly I believe, again, personally, this is just a personal perspective, given my research and my team's research, that most likely the mRNA vaccines, I believe, will be the leading vaccine candidates, given the research I have read. However, again, I don't think it's a zero-sum game and a winner takes all. I know even many of the world's developed countries have mentioned that they're open to importing other drugs from other economies as well. However, I think from a public health perspective, I know we've talked about vaccines, we've talked about treatments. I do believe that probably the most effective use of, let's say, public funds should be on the testing front, not just testing for the antigen, but also testing for the antibody. And that's something else that my team has focused on. I know a lot of governments are still focused on antigen testing, but I would like to see also antibody tests be readily available. And again, it's also about educating our political leaders about, the efficacy of a rapid test versus, tests that take maximum 24 to 48 hours. So again, testing, I believe, and that the diagnostic part of the value chain is probably more important, even at this stage as we face a second wave. And I know many public health experts have also said that, let's say, from a cost benefit, let's say, perspective, that nothing beats proper personal hygiene and wearing a mask at all times. And I know this is it boggles my mind as a rational human being why this is still a debate in the U.S. and many parts of the world about enforcing a let's say a public health mask, which is from day one has been the case here and in the Middle East. But I would also think that from a public health perspective, personal hygiene is probably also extremely important.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I call these the non-pharmacological vaccine. The wearing of a mask or a face covering is absolutely critical, and the physical distancing. I think those are probably the foundation of our current vaccines, as well as avoiding crowded and large congregations of individuals. And I mean, even if we have a vaccine tomorrow, I mean, it's not going to be a magic bullet. And I'm sure that all of our panelists can talk about all the cascade of events that would need to happen in order for us to reach the coverage that will allow us to actually not use our non-pharmacological measures that we have at hand now. Safwan?
And what it goes back to, it goes back to leadership. I mean, leadership sets the tone around these things, which gets us to a couple of questions that I found fascinating through the Q&A, having to do with the politicization of both the pandemic, but also of potential vaccines and treatments and so on. And, to the wearing of the masks, for example, I mean, that has become tribal, right? So you hear stories about, driving, for example, through the middle of America, and you can tell the political leanings of a town based on whether people are wearing masks or not in that. How do we, so my question is to any of you really, and maybe Susan, we'll go to you. I mean, how do you deal with this, the tribalism, the politicization of both the pandemic as well as the as any potential vaccines? What's the role of governments? What's the role of the various communities in one, dealing with misinformation, right, and combating it, and sort of depoliticizing to the extent that we can the conditions?
Right, absolutely. And I think this has been probably one of the main challenge in this pandemic, in all these infectious diseases caused by microorganisms, is the misinformation. And actually, I think that one of the important things is just to make clear is that the government should work in the education of the population and the work closely with the scientific community in order to provide in a very understandable way the scientific evidence about the infectious diseases, about pandemics, about the treatments and vaccines. And this is a role that all the governments and the scientific communities from countries need to address, need to take as a most important thing that probably working in the science to generate more treatments and vaccines is to educate the population regarding how this kind of pandemics can occur. And there is nothing like specifically political sides or from nationalist feelings. It's something that is not natural to the every like a biological system, that this kind of disease can happen no matter what the color, what the politics, what the country, what gender. This is something that is equally to our population and human beings. And I think that needs to be addressed mainly by education of the population and the role that each of us can take in prevention of these infectious diseases. I still believe that education is the most important thing in order that any strategy that can be raised by scientific community and all the logistic to access to treatments and vaccines could have their effect.
Thank you. Thank you. Wafa, if I may just go to another question or set of questions.
Rana wanted to add something. I just saw
Yes, thank you very much, Wafa. And just to add to what Dr. Bueno was saying, I mean, I think really what, and also to build on, the list of lessons learned from HIV that Wafa mentioned. I think what is really critical and what we keep learning again and again is the importance of having a good communication strategy as part of the response to any pandemic or any epidemic. I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about how to deal with the vaccine hesitancy and all the misinformation about vaccine. But for this pandemic in particular, I think having strong, just communication strategy, risk communications, which I think people sometimes don't fully appreciate the difference. Risk communication includes better understanding also of the epidemiology of the disease in different contexts, because this is how you're going to be able to better engage the community. And having communications, actually experts being part of the response has been very, very critical to address this. Communication is a science. It's not just about people, getting up or using the media or the social, all the social forums, but actually developing, good, strong messages to be able to deal with the individual issues. And, similarly to what happened with the HIV pandemic, there is tons of misinformation about, maybe if I can mention one thing, Safwan, in this context, one of the things we didn't talk much about, and I think it's very important since we're talking about immunizations, is access to other health services and how this pandemic has actually affected that. So for years, we have tried to build strong immunization programs for children, primary health care, for all the other essential services. And this pandemic has led to a significant mistrust in healthcare facilities in general. As a result, you have, for a while, we saw significant drop in immunizations coverage overall. We have seen significant drop in access to all kinds of services, chronic diseases, services, patients who have chronic infectious disease like HIV and TB were not able to get their medications, and the services they need. Women were not able to get their pregnancy or other health services. So I think, we need to be careful at the end. One of our first commitment is do no harm. And I think with this pandemic, we have focused so much on the, on the response to the pandemic that we have forgotten about years and years of progress in improving access to health services, whether it's prevention, which is music to my ear, hearing about all the focus on prevention, or some of these treatment services that we have been addressing. Whether treatments and vaccines, to build confidence in vaccines, I think is been great. But again, until we have a vaccine, our best effective strategy are going to be very simple: wearing masks, social distancing, personal hygiene. And interestingly enough, we are actually starting to see the impact of all of these on other diseases. So for example, in countries that usually have endemic cholera, we are seeing drops. In certain countries of Africa, they had actually lower rates of cholera this year because people are doing, better hygiene, wash, etc. In South Africa, where they're in the southern hemisphere, so that when the pandemic hit, it was also their flu season. They had lower rates of influenza because everybody was wearing masks and doing so there are some side benefits of the pandemic, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that all these other services that we need to be aware of. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, it's what Wafa, you and Wafa and Seth have said this in different ways, right? The importance of learning from lessons, learning from how we dealt with previous pandemics or situations, and we seem to not quite learn from our history. And Seth, I think what you said is really very powerful and profound in that this is not the last pandemic. This is not the last pandemic in our lifetime. Wafa, from your experience with HIV/AIDS, that perhaps nothing is as important as building health systems that can deal with this. And I recall during Ebola, Wafa, learning from you that some countries in Africa were better equipped to deal with the Ebola virus because of previous investments that they had made in preventing AIDS and what they had done in terms of building systems. So there are some questions that are coming up regarding with the vaccine, the enforcement of intellectual property, and how much enforcement should we expect, and what impact would that have on the ability to decentralize, if you will, the production and distribution of vaccine at the local level. And Michael Gruske, for example, asks, Jordan and Egypt have very robust pharmaceutical sectors. So how do you deal with the issue of IP? Moderna has said that it would not push for enforcement of intellectual property. So perhaps we can hear from a couple of you, maybe starting with you, Seth, about the issue of how do you expect this to play out? How do you think it should play out?
So thank you for the question. And first of all, I think for drugs, IP is a much more important issue. In essence, and to kind of simplify it, if you make a drug and it's chemically pure, that drug is the drug. You can, in essence, make it, and I'm overstating it, in your garage, and that's the way it is. A biologic is a living thing, made from a living thing. So there's no chemical structure that you can just test. So you have to manage the process. And the reason that's important is it's not an IP problem. I've been working in vaccines for 40 years. I can tell you a few vaccines that have been held back by IP. The big thing in vaccines is know-how. It is the 1,000 steps and all of the analytics that are necessary to be able to say that what you have in the vial is the same as what was made in a previous vial that was used in a study. And so, the IP part has to come with that know-how. So what we've seen in this case is, companies beginning to work together, putting in force collaboration, and many of them having not-for-profit pricing during the pandemic period. But we've also worked on technology transfers to companies. And what you want there is not just the permission or the IP, but you want the 5,000 pages of how they make the vaccine, because that's what you can always work around the IP if you want to, but if you want it done quickly, you've got to have that know-how that then can allow you to go to the regulators and say, here's how we can make the product, and here's the issues associated with it. Many countries have come to us and said, we would like to move into biologics manufacturing. And I think that's a good medium-term goal, but you won't be able to produce vaccines at the beginning of this pandemic doing it, because there's a very long lag time. You have to have very strong regulatory agencies because of the processes I've talked about. And then you have to, of course, have facilities that have gone through this and have the ability to do it. And then, of course, initially, when you scale up, you're going to be much more expensive than large-scale producers who have been doing it for a while. But I do think that is a long-term goal, but perhaps not something that we make as the priority in the pandemic. But think about it in that peacetime, as we talked about before, where we should have more facilities able to go for making products. Over.
Over to you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm sensitive to the time and so on. I wanted to just sort of maybe do a round of one question that I could pose to each of you. And as you look ahead over the next 3 or 4, let's say 3 to 6 months, what are the things that, what's one thing that gives you optimism, and what's one thing that worries you in terms of the response to this vaccine, or in terms to the world in which you function and you work at present? So maybe I'll start with, I'm looking here. Let me start with Rana.
Yes, we have a lot of concerns. Thanks, Wafa. I mean, I think one of our biggest just one. We're actually very worried about the upcoming flu season. We have already seen even before the winter starts, we have seen a resurgence, significant resurgence in disease in most countries in our region right now that are testing enough, at least that we can document the increase. And we are very concerned about potential combined effect of, the upcoming flu season. It's not just for flu, other respiratory diseases, etc., and its potential impact, not just because of the influenza and other diseases only, but people are going to tend to cluster or stay inside, and especially in view of the fatigue we are seeing in the populations in terms of sticking to the preventive measures, wearing masks, avoiding mass gatherings, etc. So we are really...
And the one thing that gives you optimism, or
I think the one optimism really is that global, as somebody who has now been working in vaccines for like maybe 20 years or so, I think, vaccines definitely are the hope, but also that global collaboration, and even in our region, the regional collaboration, it's very energizing, I guess, to see that, and I hope that we will continue with the same pace as the epidemic worsens or evolves, I guess.
Thank you. How about for you, Seth? What brings a smile to your face and what keeps you up at night, I guess?
Well, of course, what puts me at a smile on my face is that we've had, as Susan has talked about, this amazing outpouring of science, and that I would say that we will have hopefully an efficacious vaccine in the first or second quarter of next year. Of course, what keeps me up at night is making sure that it does get equitably distributed, gets to all the people who need it, and that we can dampen down this pandemic, which is having such a horrible effect on our societies. But I do believe we will get there as a world, and if we can, it'll open up a different way of thinking about things going forward. But we still have to get there.
Thank you. And Susan, what about for you?
Yeah, thank you. For me, I think I will start for the optimistic. I think that this pandemic and all the lessons that we have learned will make us more prepared for the next pandemic. I think definitely the strength in the scientific development, and actually in countries as Latin American countries, the establishment of important aspect of scientific development, and actually raising questions such as the availability and how we can make more prepared to get preparing or developing vaccines and treatments in a local way, actually it's building a structure that probably not only will allow us to go through this pandemic, but also for other high prevalent infectious diseases that are very important in our region.
Okay.
That's, I think, is something very important. But my concern is actually that once an effective vaccine will be announced, probably the strictness for the hygiene and other measures to prevent infections will be a little bit lessened, and probably will promote more transmission of the disease. Yeah. And I think that is something that we need to work by now to prevent.
That's a risk. Yeah. And Musad, what about for you?
Well, I think, let's say on the pessimistic side, I do believe this really requires its own panel, and maybe something for the Columbia Research Centers to think about, is the effect on the education industry, our sister industry. If you look at healthcare and education as the typical social her industries, at least when it comes from investment perspective. As a husband of an English school teacher, and my wife's also her own education was interrupted. She was a master's student at Teachers College. I can really feel the pain of teachers trying to figure out whether it's K-12 or even lonely university professors, especially operations management professors, trying to figure out how to teach their students in this new normal. And I do hope that, I am optimistic that business travel will resume. I don't think that the handshake will be eliminated from our, let's say, collective human consciousness. I believe we'll be able to hug each other in public again. I at least here in the Arab world, kiss each other again on the cheek. That will come with time. And certainly, you know, I do think that the silver lining of this pandemic has been that science is sexy again. Thankfully, people now, even layman's people, as let's say the collective IQ of human society has been destroyed by social media. Now with people trying to read up on the vaccine, read up on treatments, somehow our collective IQ, I believe, has increased through this pandemic. And definitely, you know, I don't think at least the first half of 2021 will be, let's say, on a net basis better than this year. But definitely, let's say towards the second half of 2021, hopefully beginning of 2022, we will start to feel normal again, whatever that means.
Well, thank you. And what about for you, Safwan? I won't let you off the hook.
Well, you know, the thing I'm optimistic and hopeful about the most is that next Tuesday will bring the kind of change that will propel us all forward on this and so many other things. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. I mean, you know, the thing that concerns me the most, I think, you know, things that concern me the most have been things that have been discussed and brought up by this an august panel, and that is, do we learn from this? You know, do we emerge from this knowing better and planning better, not only for our future, but more importantly for the future of our children? So that concerns me.
That's very well said. Well, I want to end by thanking all of you and thanking our wonderful panelists and thanking you, Safwan, for organizing this webinar, and to the global centers, and also thank to all the attendees who joined us today. I'm sure this will be archived somewhere and recorded, so and made available. So I'll hand it over back to you, Safwan, now.
Thank you, Wafa. Thank you. I mean, I just want to echo your thanks. You and Rana and Seth and Mus'ab and Susan, you know, so much of our hope, speaking of hope, really depends on you and on the work that you do and people out in the field, in the scientific community, people who are in the drugs and medicine industry, and let's not forget our frontline workers around the world who are really literally saving the day. So this has been incredibly informative, instructive, and I have to say quite uplifting. I mean, you know, in my introduction, I spoke about the silver lining, and you've given us a really wonderful silver lining. So I thank all of you very, very much, and stay safe.